have an hour and a half and an extremely distinguished panel. My name is Mark Halley. I'm Executive Director of the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Geneva, Switzerland, and I have the honor of being the moderator today. I was saying that we are here at the summit to try and come to grips with some of the challenges facing the green growth transition, and particularly to look at the issues surrounding finance, financial instruments, and policies. And within that, the challenges that relate to the energy transition are particularly central. I think many people would say that the success or otherwise of addressing the energy transition will determine whether or not we finally move onto a green growth platform over the coming decade or two. And so we are here at the heart of the issue. Not only are we at the heart of the issue, but the whole complex of issues relating to energy and the energy transition are particularly urgent because they relate perhaps more closely than any of the other issues to the challenge of climate change. Some people say that success in addressing our climate challenges depends on making the transition to clean, green sources of energy. And if we succeed in that, we have a good chance of addressing the climate challenges. If we fail in that, it looks very bleak for the future of the global climate. So we are here dealing with one of the absolutely essential issues. Ironically, many people can point to elements of what is needed, the kind of action that's required to make that transition. And yet, it's not happening, or it's not happening at the pace that's necessary. And so we are here to ask ourselves the question, why is that? And we will do that around a set of three questions. The first is that, actually, if you look at renewable energy or the rapid development of clean energy technology and its deployment, there are a lot of very positive stories to tell. There's a lot that has happened, and a lot of it has happened very recently. So there's been a very sharp acceleration in deployment of renewable energy and clean energy technology. But, and from that, we can certainly learn lessons. What can we learn from these good experiences that, if applied more widely, scaled up, would actually help us to through that transition more quickly? The second thing, though, is that none of us, I think, can deny that things have to happen on a much larger scale. They have to go much more quickly if we're to rise to the challenge and transition to green growth. And we all know that there are things tripping up that progress. There are obstacles in the way. Many of them, we feel, that can be dealt with. And so what are these obstacles, and which are the really key ones that we need to focus on if we're going to make this transition to a clean energy foundation for green societies? And finally, it's a bewildering mix of regulatory, policy, financial, many other elements that need to be addressed. And of course, we should do all of that. But within there is an optimal mix of measures that each country might take that would ensure that the transition takes place as smoothly as possible and as quickly as possible. So in terms of organizing the sessions, I will introduce the panel. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make a very quick intervention to lay some of the key issues on the table. And I'll ask you to take note of those and retain those. At the end of these four, I will ask the panelists to comment on what they've heard from their fellow panelists very briefly. And then we will move into a more interactive session in which I will invite audience participation, audience reaction, audience questions and comments, grouped very roughly around those three questions that we're trying to address in this session. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kirit Parikh from India. I could probably spend the hour and a half introducing Dr. Parikh and talking about his achievements and his merits and the honors and the many books that he has written. I'll limit myself to saying that he is a former member of India's Planning Commission and chairman of the Integrated Research and Action for Development. He's also well known and widely recognized for his role as the architect of India's Integrated Energy Policy Committee. So he comes with enormous experience in energy in a country probably absolutely key to the energy transition and to the challenge of green growth. So Dr. Parikh, could you give us some of your thoughts?
Thank you, Mark. I think your first question is, what have we learned from recent things? I may say that India had set up a national action plan on climate change, we had the Prime Minister constituted a National Committee on Climate Change, and that formulated this National Action Plan on Climate Change. It has a number of missions. One is on sustainable energy, on solar mission. Another is on sustainable habitat, then one on energy efficiency. So many of the themes that are being discussed here, we have separate missions which really try to address the various issues here. Now, we have promoted a lot of renewable energy in the last few years. For example, we have 17,000 megawatts of wind energy. We have some 1,000 megawatt of solar energy of PV systems at the moment, and all these have come in the recent years. What one finds here, the difficulties, as I said, because we are talking about barriers, is that after a while, evacuation of this power becomes an issue. For example, Tamil Nadu has much of the wind power there, and then we find that some of the wind power plants are unable to sell the wind power that they have. Similarly, we find that there is a lot of enthusiasm, and because this renewable energies are relatively small scale, 1 megawatt, 2 megawatts, 3 megawatts, and compared to coal-based and other power plants which are 100, 200, 500 megawatts. So the investment requirement is small, and so many enthusiastic entrepreneurs want to get into this and they bid for it. So when we invite bids, lots of people bid for the solar power plant, but not all of them are able to eventually deliver on the promise that they have made. The second issue I think which is important is in all of this there is a financial closure is the main thing, because the initial investment is high that they need financial closure. Now we have followed two different alternative ways of incentivizing people. One is the feed-in tariff mechanism. The other is renewable portfolio obligations way, in which then the market price gets determined. And each one of them has certain problems. For example, the feed-in tariff, we are providing a competitively bid feed-in tariff. So there is a reverse bidding. Firms are asked or told, here are sites where you can set up solar power plants, and we promise you to give for next 15 years the feed-in tariff that you want. And then, but you have to bid for it in a competitive manner so that the feed-in tariff, what you want. So the first round of feed-in tariff, where we are expecting a price of around 15 rupees a kilowatt hour, you can say $1 is 50 rupees. So this was 15 rupees a kilowatt hour was expected. The lowest bid came to 13.5 rupees. The next round, only about less than 2 years later, produced a bid of 9.5 rupees. So it is in fact bringing down the solar cost. But at the same time, what one finds is they are still having difficulties because they are not sure whether the state would give this money or not. Gujarat, for example, the state of Gujarat in India, took a different strategy. It said, we will give you this fixed tariff of 11 rupees or 10 rupees for 12 years, and lots of people found that much more certain and went in for that. However, now what is happening is, when lots of plants have gone into Gujarat, the financiers look at the Gujarat's balance sheet, at the state's balance sheet, and say, would the state be able to support this additional FIT that you will get? The message I want to drive is that renewable energy currently requires a lot of subsidies of one kind or the other, and there is a huge problem of absorbing it in a system. And as long as there is a small amount of renewable, say, but with India's 40,000 megawatt of wind, or rather hydel capacity, we can perhaps easily absorb 100,000 megawatt of renewable energy by providing the necessary balancing load. But once you go to a larger scale, balancing it is going to be a difficult problem. So you will need to have some kind of storage system or some kind of balancing. So either you expand substantially your hydel, substantially your gas capacity, natural gas based, or you bring in storage, wind or solar with storage. And that makes the cost even higher still. So we need to face these two issues. One is how to give the financial closure. Secondly, particularly when you have difficulties of, when you go to upscale, because there is a certain nonlinearity about it, then how do you absorb this power into your system? And these, I think, are really important issues for this. The renewable portfolios obligations that we have stipulated, many states have stipulated, that produces a price for the power, renewable power on the market. But then they're not sure what is the price going to be, and there again some financial closure problem comes in. Also, there are difficulties in a federal country like India that all the states have separate renewable portfolio obligation standard. Ideally, it would be that they should all have the same standard. The standard should be dictated by our need to how much renewable energies we want to push into the system, and that there should be certain certainty about, given by a floor price and a ceiling price given on these issues. And the the group that I'm chairing currently, expert group on low carbon strategy for inclusive growth, we will recommend some of these policies changes that I hope will eventually find their way. But nonetheless, the current challenges are these.
Thank you very much. You've laid some extremely important points on the table, perhaps the principal one relating to finance being that unless we can offer predictability, policy stability, the investors are very unlikely to come in behind us, even though the challenge is great. The second speaker I'd like to introduce is Martin Hiller. Martin Hiller is the Director General of the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, REAP, and a long-standing expert in renewable energy, climate policy, and so on, and is the president of the board of the Gold Standard Foundation, which has won many awards as a certification scheme that's mobilized a great deal of funding for carbon offset projects. Martin, please.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe at the beginning I'll just say one of the essential services that REAP has provided over the last, let's say, 7 or 8 years was that we were a funder, and we are a funder of projects in the field of market development of renewable energy and energy efficiency. But we also have a strong focus on access to energy, on that whole topic of access to energy. And in that context, I think one thing that we focus, and I focus a lot on, is the question of how to look at energy in the terms of co-benefits. I think that once you go outside of a circle of people who deal with energy policy every day, energy becomes a very abstract term. You actually don't know exactly what energy is. You can't really feel it. You really see energy in the terms of what you can do with it. So I think when we look at efficient use of energy in whatever context, it is important to put that into relation to not just energy productivity, but also in context of, how many jobs can you create with that? How can you strengthen the small and medium enterprise sector? How can you strengthen health or education, etc.? So you see it in a wider context. And what strikes me at this conference and at other conferences is that we talk a lot about policy arrangements and regulatory arrangements, and they are very, very important. That is absolutely no question. But we also talk a lot about finance and the question, why do investors who invest at least $1 trillion every year in energy in general actually not really go sufficiently in some of these areas? I think in some areas, wind energy, industrialized wind energy, you start to get very, very big industries there, but in other areas you actually don't get enough traction. So why is it not happening? And there is somehow a mismatch between the investment community and many projects that start on the ground. We see that a lot because the speciality of REAP is to fund not at a big level. We are not an African development bank or an Asian development bank, far from that. And so we fund at a level of €150,000, $200,000, that kind of level, which is small. and that can be seen as a disadvantage. But it is also, it has advantages. For instance, it's very precise. You see exactly what you can do with that. And it is quite handy and quite useful to initiate things. And with that kind of funding, and let's say with much funding up to an area of $500,000 or a bit more, people can actually start up things and can create model projects. But we see again and again that models get stuck and don't grow, especially when you really talk about hardware installation. And one of the reasons why models get stuck is that they can't find the investor. You know, they get maybe a grant, like a grant from us in the area of 200 or a few $100,000. But then when they want to grow a project, they need to get investment. They need to get either a loan or they need to get an equity investor. They need to get somebody who comes in and helps them to grow this. And this space between, let's say, $500,000 and $5 or $8 or $10 million is extremely difficult to get. Even if you have a good business model, you don't find the money. International investors normally don't really look at that space because it's too small. And local investors, if they exist, don't feel confident about that space because they haven't done it before. And they don't really see where this is coming from. So there needs to be a translation device. And what we are developing at the moment, together with another organization, is to try to find a kind of ladder that people can climb, project developers can climb when they have got a successful first step. We call that, of course, we can't call that ladder because that wouldn't be elegant enough. So we call it phased finance facility. And we're developing that together with an organization. For those of you who know it, they have a really complicated name. They're called CTI PFAN, which stands for the Clean Technology Initiatives Private Finance Advisory Network. They come actually out of the UNFCCC technology discussion. But this Private Finance Advisory Network is a very pragmatic approach to basically help project developers in developing countries to design their projects in a way that international investors can understand, to make an investment plan. But they do it with them, so they basically leave the knowledge with the project developer afterwards. And then they do matchmaking with a circle of investors that they have, and they enlarging that circle. When they have a problem with pipeline, they just can't get, they get about one deal per month out now, which is not bad, but they have much more. They have so far leveraged about $500 million in investment. So that doesn't go through them. That's investors then investing in projects. And their pipeline is too small. And we sit on our grant facility, which has a number of strong possibilities. And we see that people initiate things and then they can't grow. So we said, okay, let's join this. Let's help with the grant facility to help developers establish basically everything to the pre-feasibility level. So that you have the model worked up, that you have the analysis done of how you would actually build scale on the basis of your successful model, and that you have your pre-feasibility closed. And then PFAN would come in and take over and finalize the investment plans and help with the matchmaking. And then we have a number of other steps. Basically, there are often some questions open in finalization, and you go until the deal. And what we want to put in addition is a kind of M&E process, a monitoring and evaluation process that tells us where are the strengths, where are the barriers in this specific project in the country, and take the lessons out of the project and portray those up into policy making. So that you get, in addition to everything that you get from bottom up and international comparisons or regional comparisons, etc., in addition to everything else, you get actually a stronger experience from the ground, from businesses that want to build scale. That's essentially, I think, what I want to put out as a first point. But let me just point out one additional element that is really, really important in this context. People who build new business, and that can be normal business, social business, or it can be NGO business if you want, really non-for-profit business. People who manage to build this and build scale are are, well, I wouldn't say they are very rare, but they are, you have to look for them. Not everybody is an entrepreneur. You need to find people with entrepreneurial skills. So these champions who can really do on the ground are an incredibly important group to look at. And I think with a lot of the work of GGGI, of REAP, of NREL, of many others, the people that we need to see as our core audience, as our heroes, if you want, as our champions, are those people who really build those kind of enterprises.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was an extremely interesting set of points. I think the ones I'd like to underline for later discussion is that I think we all know where we need to go. There's a lot of technology available to go there. There's a lot of friendly finance out there, but the connections aren't being made. Often it's the mechanisms, the institutions, issues of policy design, sometimes very practical things. And if we could address those and address them successfully, we might find that investment flow is greatly increased. And of course, the need for champions, that's true in almost every area of green growth. So with that, I'll turn to the next speaker, Doug Arendt. Doug is the Executive Director of the Joint Institute of Strategic Energy Analysis at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States. Doug has a long-standing involvement in many facets of the debate on energy and climate in the United States, and particularly the whole issue of policy transformation and policy design. I said when introducing Kirit Parikh that if India succeeds, the world may succeed, and that's certainly true of the United States as well. Only the difference is the United States has the technology, the capital, the know-how. How do we make the magic mixture work so that the United States leads the world on renewable energy or on the clean energy transition?
Yeah, thank you very much. So good question. Let me start with reflecting on a couple different pieces. The first is that the United States has a very different, I'll call it ecosystem, for lack of a better term, for clean energy. That's very deep, all the way from technology innovation in the universities and the national labs through to the marketplace. And I think the important point of noting this is that there are two continuums that I think we need to be mindful of. One is the technology continuum and how a company actually gets founded and grows, and in particularly, I'll call it in the energy space where that's so complex, when a company may not necessarily own or be the project developer on one front. And the second continuum is the finance continuum. And the third, then let me introduce that, is actually a policy continuum. So that the policies aren't necessarily only about at the end game, i.e. a renewable portfolio standard or a renewable fuel standard or a fiscal instrument that might support that or not, like a feed-in tariff or something else. But in fact, if you look all the way through that innovation chain, and it a little bit comes back to what Martin just said about how do you start small entrepreneurial adventures, particularly in developing countries, is you want to look at the policy framework and the instruments that are put in place that actually encourage entrepreneurialism at the front end, be that grants or small loans or equity investments, all the way through to what financing mechanisms are available to enable that company to expand. In the U.S., that's classically going to be private equity if it's in a private company, and then those private equity investors and the venture capital investors look for an exit, they would call it, i.e. an acquisition to a larger company, initial public offering into the public markets, etc. That's a very different landscape than necessarily a project financier who's looking at just raising debt for a project to leverage their equity. So I think we want to be a little bit mindful of the landscape that we look at and some examples in the U.S. that have worked and not worked. Clearly on the, I'll call it on the market side of the equation, the U.S. is very active, not at a federal level, but at state levels on the, I'll call it the policy end or the market end of that equation with renewable portfolio standards, some states actually with feed-in tariffs. on a broader clean energy standpoint, there's a national renewable fuel standard. That's actually fairly aggressive on alternative fuels to come in there. Also on broadly, I'll call it clean energy and green growth, there's now a revamped CAFE standard as well. And there are some interesting lessons that I think we all are familiar with, or if not, certainly learned a little bit from the last plenary in terms of the proper structuring of some of those market-oriented policies, whether or not the country or the government bears the risk and the financial cost, i.e. Spain's structure of a feed-in tariff, versus the consumers bearing that risk, i.e. Germany or many others. That's a very different structure, and of course, as we started off, how do you manage the risk mitigation of a fiscal instrument like that, be it in the U.S. a production tax credit, which goes on and off and introduces a lot of hiccups into the manufacturing and production cycle, or ill-structured feed-in tariffs, which have to be ratcheted back, rather than thoughtfully put together in the first place with collars around them, as we can well think about. Let me talk just a little bit about the pathway forward, particularly across that continuum, because I think it's important, and then we'll come back. There's a lot of material that we can cover on all sorts of ground. There are a few major initiatives in the United States, again, trying to cover that whole continuum of technology innovation through the marketplace. These run all the way from the President through the Department of Energy through to many states. And so there's one on clean energy manufacturing, so it's a large initiative that complements a whole slew of national level activities which are focused on really the innovation cycle. So these are clean energy technology hubs, for example, that have been funded and founded in partnership with universities and national labs and companies to focus on certain technologies with very aggressive goals. For example, to lessen or have the cost of solar, have the cost of wind going forward, etc. There are also a whole slew of, I'll call it, much more disruptive, again, early stage technology investments, which is all part of a policy funded by a program called ARPA-E, which is Advanced Research Program for Energy. Again, that was a policy framework put in place. All of that generates, I'll call it, an innovation engine and a capacity engine, which I think we're all clamoring for, which is how do we create speed and scale? How do we create more capacity, more companies that can bring these technologies to the market faster? That then is complemented by a suite of, I'll call it, market-oriented policies, which continue to evolve and work. Many states, there are more than 30 states that have RPSs in the U.S. Again, I talked about a national renewable fuel standard. A lot of that is going through, I'll call it, continued evolution. And the challenge I think that we have to come up with is, in a relatively quickly evolving sector, how do we come up with policy environments which, I'll steal a term that friends at Deutsche Bank introduced a few years ago, are transparent, they have longevity, and they introduce certainty. And so let me just show one example that's very specific to the U.S., and then we can go on. The production tax credit in the U.S. Has been what's classically called an on and off policy. It's been put in place for a few years, but then it had a very definitive cutoff date. And one can see that the clean energy industries, their growth mimicked the availability of that policy on and off, and has introduced significant disruption into the investment cycle, into the manufacturing cycle, with that on and off, I'll call it, characteristic. The dialogue now actually is moving in a collective way to how to craft a next generation production tax credit that has a transparent and clear roadmap from a certain initial starting point to zero. And getting the industry behind that is saying we would appreciate a transparent roadmap to the point where we are, quote, subsidy free. if you want to think about how subsidies are. It's a very nice example of that. And then there's many other activities, some of them mentioned a little bit in the plenary, about how do we lower the cost of capital into clean energy technologies, into the companies and into those projects. And we can talk about some of those in the question and answer. So I think I'll stop my initial remarks there.
Thanks very much, Doug. Your points underline one thing that's absolutely fundamental, and that is that the solution for one country is going to be different from the solution for another country, and that the transition strategy is going to have to be built on the realities, on the institutions, and on the culture of the country. But I also think it's important that you have borne out the point made by the other speakers, namely that unless we can introduce some policy stability, some policy predictability into this equation, we are not going to attract investors on a large scale. There are many reasons why investors aren't rushing into renewable energy, and perhaps one of the most significant of those is that people want assurance. People want to know what the market is going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, to the extent possible. So that's a point I think that we need to come back to in the discussion. So the final speaker here, last but by no means least, is Sharmila Naidu from South Africa. Sharmila is the director of the Misuka Green Development Consulting Group, and she has, before that, done an extraordinary number of interesting things in South Africa and elsewhere, advising on climate strategy, on climate finance, on energy policy, and in particular spent 10 years working in the South Africa National Treasury. So although she knows everything there is to be known about energy policy, she also knows it very solidly from a financial point of view, which is the focus we're giving to it today. So Sharmila, please.
Thank you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. You heard Michael Liebrich earlier on in the plenary say that South Africa outran Brazil on renewable energy in 2012, and I'm sure some of you are curious as to how that happened. So I'm glad he mentioned it, because he gave me a brilliant opening for what I'm going to say, and that's the story I'm going to tell you. How did we do it in South Africa? And part of what Mark mentioned now is it's going to be different in different countries, definitely. So that points to the reality, the institutions that are needed, and also the culture. So I'm going to touch on these three things when I go through the story. So what is the South African renewable energy story? We produce more than 60% of Africa's energy, average about 34,000 megawatts of electricity current demand, and we play, of course, a huge energy security role in the region. It's largely from coal. We have very cheap coal. We're one of the largest, worst emitters globally of greenhouse gases, and particularly when you look at it from a per capita point of view. But in the past 3 years, more or less, we've managed to outstrip Brazil. So how did that happen? What were the perfect storm factors that allowed that to happen? A couple of things. The Honorable Mr. Jagdu from Guyana mentioned this morning that political will, it's a cliche, but it's absolutely essential. That's been our experience. It is essential, but what are the drivers of political will? What causes governments to say, we're going to take this on and we're going to commit to it and put all of our resources behind it? In South Africa, there were two key factors. One was there was a growing realization that renewable energy, the shift to renewable energy, didn't necessarily mean a loss of jobs. And in a country like South Africa, growth and jobs is government's mantra. We have a very high unemployment rate, we have high inequality. If things can be as green as they can be, but if they're not going to create growth and jobs, it's not going to be very popular. So there was this realization that we could find ways of creating, for example, a supply chain for the solar industry, that we could green procurement around renewable energy, that we could use it to create jobs, to create skills in particular areas. Possibly more than that was a crisis. And crisis, I think in most countries, different crises force policy changes. And in South Africa, that crisis was in 2007, a series of rolling blackouts and brownouts that happened. We had huge electricity gaps. And those two things together created enormous political will. There was finally the writing on the wall, and reading through some of that, if you Google rolling blackouts, you'll actually see, very unusually for any government, ministers and even the president saying, we made a mistake, we weren't paying enough attention. Public statements saying, we made a mistake, we weren't paying attention to Eskom, our power utility. We didn't listen to the warning signs that we were going to run out. Now, our power comes from coal, and it takes a long time to build coal stations. So renewable energy was the logical way to go. So that was some of the perfect storm. There was also a realization that technology has shifted, that not only is it available, it's been proven to work in places like Spain and in Germany, but also it was becoming better and it was becoming cheaper. So that was the third factor. And then lastly, that as the base price was rapidly increasing, as we moved away from subsidizing electricity and as the pricing structure changed, grid parity was becoming closer. And so this was a combination of factors that caused South Africa to go very quickly and definitely with a great deal of certainty to investors onto our renewable energy path that started in 2011. So I think the key question, or one of the key questions here, is looking at finance. So there's, on the basis of what I've just said, the question arises, how do you blend finance? What finance do you blend and how do you blend this? And the South African Renewables Initiative, which I worked on, was something that originated, surprisingly enough, in the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, who wanted to have a forward-looking strategy on, we're not going to lose out, and I'm almost paraphrasing the Minister of Trade and Industry here, we're not going to lose out on the renewable energy market as we lost out on the ICT market in South Africa. So how do we step ahead of the curve and make sure that we benefit from this? How do we use it to create jobs, to expand our manufacturing base? And what the idea that evolved from this question was the South African Renewables Initiative, SARI. Some of the lessons from SARI, I'm not going to bore you with the details of SARI, but I'm going to tell you some of the lessons from SARI and from the first Renewable Energy IPP program. In terms of barriers and what we've learned, you have to have a marriage between the executive and the official levels. The politicians can say, we want this done, but the officials need to buy into it and actually make it happen. No single department can do climate change or renewable energy on its own. You need collaborative government, which in most countries is very difficult to get. Government is designed to work in a fragmented way, in silos, as we say in South Africa. I don't know if you use the term here, but government is used to working and is set up to work on an issue and by issue basis. And if you're going to pursue a renewable energy program to scale, that's not going to get you very far. So you need to find mechanisms that allow government to work across departments and across tiers, so from national to local. There's a question around, how do you brew an innovative idea? How do you, government isn't known, governments around the world are known for being innovative. And SARI was created with an idea that emerged in a workshop with the Minister of Trade and Industry, and then was brewed a little bit outside, and then gradually became embedded into government, so that now it's within the Department of Energy. There's pros and cons to that method. The point I'm making is that innovation outside of government with an idea that comes from government is sometimes, given the right conditions, a good way to go. So don't assume that if the idea comes from government, it needs to continue in government in the early phases. There has to be coherence across policies, and I think I'm stating the obvious here, but it's less easy to do. But the climate change policy has to talk to your industrial policy, it has to talk to your energy policy, for example. And we were, in South Africa, the climate change white paper was released a year after the integrated resource plan that targeted the renewable energies in the energy mix. I think something else is the consolidation of instruments for financing. There's so many instruments out there. There's domestic instruments, there's international instruments, there's a blend, and local governments, for example, find it extremely difficult to navigate this maze. How do you consolidate and simplify? How do you make it easier? It points to what Martin was saying earlier about the project development. In South Africa, we're finding that it's not only the project development assistance that's needed, it's also a kind of mapping of what's available out there and what's needed to access it. So to summarize, I'm going to say that there's 5 key things. Ensuring policy coherence across all spheres of government, securing economic opportunity across the supply chain. In South Africa, that's really, really important, as I said before. Establishing global competitiveness and export potential in niche products and services. That was what the Department of Trade and Industry went for. And supporting a focused and coherent approach to research and development and skills development. You can't do anything at scale without research and building your skills base, which is a big challenge for us in South Africa. And I think I'm going to end there and take the rest of the time from the group.
Thanks very much. You introduced an extremely important dimension there, or 2 dimensions. One is getting the narrative right, how you sell the transition to clean energy, and your point about the need to focus on the social impacts, on employment impacts, and so on, and ensuring that those are positive seems to be a very important part of the mix. The second, of course, is to point us to the sort of governance challenges related to the green energy transition. And we might, I think, sometimes have a tendency to underplay those. They are extraordinarily important, and they make a difference between success and failure. The one thing that you touched on, and perhaps this is something on which I can ask briefly for comments from the other panelists, is the whole question that renewable energies, we like to talk of them as win-wins, as something that is nothing but good, and so on. But you mentioned South Africa's coal industry and its considerable investment in traditional energy. So how do we deal with the sort of losers in this transition? I don't think we can pretend that everybody's going to benefit. How do we deal with the losers, and what do we do with the investments that are sort of left out there as we move to the renewables area? I think that perhaps an honest attention to the fact that this is not simply a win-win situation, but one that's delicate from the point of view of investors, delicate from the point of view of communities, and something that needs to be addressed with perhaps more honesty than there has been in the debate so far. Doug, you want to pick up on that?
I'll start in. I think the simple way to think about it, at least that I think about it, is that there's healthy competition in all sectors, and there are winners and losers. And so I think that the key thing that we think about, particularly as we think broadly about the energy system, is what are the attributes of the energy system of the future that we all want? And if we think about reliable, affordable, resilient, clean, decarbonized, but maybe more importantly, environmentally, I'll call it benign, or as benign as possible. There are some winners in that, and there are some losers. And I think the key to be mindful is what do you do with that skill set? And can you manage the transition so that you minimize, I'll call it the asset loss, if you want to be concerned about that, as long as it's a social good. Now, there are lots of experiences, for example, in other sectors, other industries, like the telecom industry, where it was open and full competition, and there was lots of investment and lots of loss. Yet, there are still winners, and we all carry around our cell phones, and technology continues to evolve, and we have improved services. So, to me, it feels as though it's a little bit of a false argument that says we have to save everyone or every different piece of the industry. I think what we need to do is have this open, frank dialogue about what are the attributes that we want in the future, and set that policy goal, and then let the industries compete. Who can meet that? Now, the coal industry could compete actually very effectively in a policy environment where carbon is priced well and they do CCS, et cetera, et cetera. So they could be winners, but they need a level policy environment as well. So it's not just about renewables, it's about carbon, not just promoting clean.
That's true. That's true in the political dialogue as well. Just put it down to competition and say, get out there and compete. Okay, Dr. Perry?
Yeah, I think saying that in a market mechanism, in a market, there are winners and losers, and that is not quite an appropriate analogy to make here. If I'm talking about promoting renewables, giving subsidies, giving public support to it, and I make a case by saying that, look, that this is creating more employment, then I must make an honest calculation and say, what are the employment I'm losing on the other side, and make a net gain. I often see sometimes people calculate net co-benefits in a way as if all the benefits are accruing from this renewable. But a lot of the benefits come from supplying electricity. So you should really calculate the benefits of supplying electricity by A mechanism or supplying electricity by mechanism B. And that kind of clarity and I think honesty is required in these co-benefits approach.
Yeah, so a lot more transparency in the debate that we've had so far, and a lot more honesty, I guess, in working out who wins and who loses, and what we need to do about that. Martin?
Nobody can protest that, right? But just to remind people, the subsidy question comes up again and again, and that is a question of political leadership. Where do we want to put our subsidies? I can't remember the exact figure now, but I think the fossil fuel subsidies, the IEA said, globally are at 400 billion or something like that annually. So there's a large chunk of subsidies that can gradually move over to something else that is more desirable. So I think there is also a large chunk of money that can possibly, as the Danish minister Christian Friis said this morning, rather be used for social security nets than for cover-all subsidies that everybody gets, disregarding if they're rich or poor in the country.
So yeah, a very important point that competition works best if there's a reasonably level playing field, and that a lot of things are currently falsifying that debate and that equation. Therefore, we need to address those. Okay, last point about winners and losers.
I think just to say that in terms of coal, it's a long-term game. So the more transparent you are, the better it is. And as you have policy certainty and long-term policy, with that kind of assurance, both the potential losers and the winners know where to go and how to change.
That's probably the issue that comes up most in talking about with investors, the policy uncertainty, and therefore the massive inflation of the risk associated with renewable energies. And very often, as a result of rather clumsy attempts to support the renewables energy, like the Spain feed-in tariff, and if you give a tariff and then take it away, you probably set back the transition by a decade, because people won't go there again once they've been burned. So this is clearly a central focus in our challenge. I like, Doug, your idea of a roadmap to subsidy-free existence, because we can't simply try and give our investors a 3-year horizon or 5-year horizon. We have to know that this is within the context of a policy-supported framework and strategy that will take us right across the transition to clean energy over time. So, thanks. Yes, a comment on that.
Yeah. Can I just make a point on that? I forgot to mention that there was a little bit of a hiccup. Well, there were many hiccups, but one quite public hiccup in the South African situation was that we had announced a refit and then discovered that it was illegal to do so. And so the issue you mentioned about Spain and Spain's refit, that happened in South Africa. We had announced a refit, and just over a year later, we had to take it back and introduce a blend because the refit went against government's procurement regulations according to legal opinion. And the investors were extremely kind to us. They stuck in there and said, well, these are your teething problems because it's the first round. So I think part of why I've had to think about why it is they were kind to us, it's because there was constant dialogue and there was a platform for dialogue. And I think that's critical.
Okay.
One thing, I mean, just to understand the scale of problem on financing, we did some scenarios of India's for the let's say next 50 years up to 2050, and had a business as usual scenario, and which emitted say something like 300 odd gigatons of CO2 over 2010 to 2050, and made another scenario where you say we restrict this emission to 150, and the difference in the GDP, the present discounted value of GDP, was something like 5 trillion US dollars in constant dollar term. So it present discounted value. So I think the kind of financing scales that required is really huge, and one needs to factor this into out, keep a long-term perspective, and see what are we talking about.
Yes, the figures given by IEA for the global investment needs in clean energy, or in energy in general, and clean energy, are absolutely massive. Now, in most places, that would translate into an extraordinary investment opportunity. If the need is out there and the capital is available, you would think that investors would be rushing there. And what we're examining today is why they aren't rushing there at the sort of pace that's required, and why they're holding back.
I feel that's a wrong argument. I mean, this is the amount of money I need if I want to put it so much of electrical capacity through renewables. But if I want to have so much electrical capacity to non-renewables, the same investment opportunity exists with a much higher rate of return. So why is there more investment opportunity when there is money available for renewables?
Well, I promised to throw it to the audience and to the floor, and I will do that. I said earlier that I would try and group things around the three principal questions that we set out in the note. I think we should try and do that, but we don't have a huge amount of time, so I don't think you need to feel that you're held strictly to that. But just to remind you, the first set of questions relates to, or the first set of issues relates to, the lessons we can learn from the positive experience in deploying renewable energy and clean energy over the past decade or two. What in that can be built upon and scaled up? The second has to do with what are the obstacles, and we've examined some of them here on the panel. What are the things that are currently slowing the flow of investment money into this sector? And of those, which are the really key ones? I mean, we've talked about institutional limitations, capacity limitations, siloization, policy incoherence, etc., the aversion of investors to risk. There are many factors out there, fossil fuel subsidies. Which of these, A, is really important, and which of them is ripe for action today? Which ones, if we placed a lever there, would lead to a really massive change? And finally, what is the sort of optimal policy mix of policy interventions, tools, fiscal instruments, and so on, that we could deploy now to speed up the transition and thereby achieve green growth? So with that, I will invite the audience to step in. The Rules are, please introduce yourself, say who you are, and keep your questions short or comments short and sharp, and if possible, address them to one of the members of the panel. I think we have roaming mics. Yes, sir, please. Oh, yeah. Mics seem to be on cables, so they take a while to come.
Speak loudly.
Thank you. My name is Fitran Aldiansha. I'm from the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. I'd like to ask Miss Nadu from South Africa, especially from the lesson lens of energy policy and governance in South Africa. It seems that the government of South Africa has been able to build trust with the private sector and also from the investor. I mean, listening to your story, you said that the investor are kind enough or were kind enough to wait. I'm just wondering whether it's more than only open dialogue, whether there's a lot of experience before, incentives provided, transparency, and then what sort of things that you can tell us more in terms of promoting this kind of trust, especially for many emerging economies in this room. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll take 2 or 3 more. It might be easier, the gentleman in the back, to come around and speak into the mic because it's attached to a cable, so it's not as mobile as we had hoped. And please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Kevin Arama from the Africa Technology Policy Studies Network. My question is more about the packaging of the discussion on clean energy. Coming from Nigeria and many Africa countries where only about 31% of the population have energy access. If you remove South Africa, that figure goes up very, very quickly. For us there, and for most policymakers, it's not a trade-off between renewables and non-renewables. It is more of building in energy efficiency measures, better technologies and innovations in extracting the non-renewables and using them to expand energy access, while also including or diversifying the energy mix to include renewables. So from the discussions that I've been hearing, it's more of like, it's an either or, and then what triggered this question is about the losers and winners. There's a lot of space within the energy markets for Africa that I can speak of, for both renewables and non-renewables. But then how do we decouple the carbon footprint of using both of these issues? Because again, we need to think about renewables as not carbon free in many ways. If solar panels are produced in China and shipped to Africa, there is some carbon footprint in that. And we need to really be very careful in terms of how we sell this to policymakers so that we're not shifting discussion as if we're just leaving all the industrials and industrialization process through non-renewable energy to renewable energy options only. So that's a comment that I'd like to make. Then the other one is, it does seem as if we're just tinkering around the issues. The massive perverse subsidies on non-renewable energy sources, fossil fuels specifically, is actually skewing the market so much against any competitive advantage for renewable energy. How can we address that issue, fossil fuel subsidies? In Nigeria, that's up to 4% of GDP. In some other countries in Africa, it's up to 7% of GDP. Does it make any economic sense to do something like that?
Thank you. Third one in the back there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nadia. I'm from Mexico and interning in UNSCAP. So my question is about, for instance, in the case of the US, like all of this boom of unconventional fossil fuels, how do you feel that it's going to affect the renewable deployment in the US, but also in the world? And for instance, in comparison with the case of Africa, based on the experiences in my country, more or less, which is somehow very sad, is like the policymakers are just thinking in the short term. Even though there is a law, suddenly if in the terms of politicians is not good enough to create or develop the renewable energies, then they are also focused just in the short term, in the case of creating employments and everything. So I would like to know, for instance, in the case of Africa, how you could overcome the situation about the generation of employments for the creation of the technology. I mean, I don't know, and I would like to know if you were importing the technology, in, for instance, for China, or if you created this market. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we'll let the panel address those questions, and several were addressed to you. Sharmila, you would like to maybe take a start?
So, of course, the private sector is never just kind. There's always profit involved. So, so yes, there was an element of saying, you guys are doing this for the first time, so there's mistakes to be made. Mistakes are expected. But also, there was a huge carrot. And the carrot that was dangled was whether or not there was a refit, it was going to be profitable. So I would put that as the most important thing, that it was clear that whether it was a refit or it was a blend, as it turned out to be, it was going to be extremely profitable. Perhaps not as profitable as it would have been if it was the refit, but profitable enough for the private sector to stay in. And then there was the issue of constant dialogue between government and the private sector. And I would add to that faith in the individuals who were working on the program. I think the trust was established over a period of time, but the people working on the program had been involved in development finance institutions and this kind of, it was the public-private partnerships unit within the National Treasury that was assisting the Department of Energy with doing the first procurement, or is assisting the Department of Energy. And so there was a great deal of faith in the Treasury, as well as in the Department of Energy. But from a financier point of view, the fact that the National Treasury was involved gave it an added oomph and what's the word I'm looking for? Confidence. So I hope that answers that. And then politicians thinking short term, we have exactly the same experience. It's particularly visible at local government level in terms of 5-year plans and what happens running up to elections and what happens or doesn't happen after that. But I think we in South Africa, the South African experience is we now have a national planning commission. We have produced a national development plan that looks at the long term. And while it's not binding on every department, it's adopted by cabinet, and it forces the different ministries to work together, even if it's just to debate the issues, you know, and agree to disagree, as is happening on some of the issues raised in the National Development Plan. And then together with that, just to answer your question on the technology, we are importing technology. So let's take the example of solar panels. The components are imported from China largely, and some of them are assembled in South Africa. We had one, we now have 2 plants. And as the build program gets off the ground and the demand increases, what government has done, and this is why the Department of Trade and Industry and the Industrial Policy Action Plan has been so critical, is put into the procurement for the renewable energy program that X percentage must be local content, and X percentage must be procured locally. And that kind of, so you have the push on the side of government to say, hey, we not only want you to do this by community upliftment wherever it is you put your plants, but also you must use, and we're going to score you on it, what percentage is your local content?
Thank you. That, of course, can get you in trouble with WTO rules and investment agreements and so on, but we don't have time to go into that. Doug, you're welcome to react to anything, but could you certainly address that question of whether new finds of carbon-based energy are wrecking the market for renewable energy?
Yeah, happy to. It's a good way to say it. To speak frankly, the unconventional gas and oil, which has really been led globally in the U.S., was unpredicted. It's actually quite fascinating. It is a unique phenomena, and there are some benefits and there are some risks to it. And I study that gas and shale effort quite deeply. The benefit, of course, that you're seeing in the U.S. is that shale gas, in particular low-price gas, has displaced a fair amount of coal. So you actually see net greenhouse gas reductions from the U.S. sector, with a couple of caveats that are still yet to be really resolved on the technical front in terms of methane emissions from production through the pipeline, which introduces a question about the net global warming potential and things like that. But on the gas renewables front specifically, there are a couple things just to keep in mind. First off, that there was euphoria for a little while when gas prices went to their really lifetime low. As I believe Michael mentioned in his comments, they're now approximately 2 times where they were from their low, and they're still slightly under where the industry thinks that they need to be sustainable, i.e. to have continued production. So the pathway forward for natural gas to be, as an industry itself, sustainable is toward higher prices. So one thing that introduces back into the equation, of course, is that there is much greater, there's a much smaller gap in the marginal price of power from gas and renewables going forward than the perception that has been placed in many people's minds when it was literally 50% of the price a couple of years ago. That's one. The second one is that there's increasing understanding of the value of a portfolio of technologies or of fuel sources or energy sources. That is both in the regulators and the utilities, but also in the financing offices and from the financiers. A lot of detailed work on the value of portfolios, particularly of dissimilar assets, one where you can, for example, dispatch a gas plant versus renewables where you have to take in the power when it's produced. And then lastly, we've done a fair amount of, I'll call it fairly leading edge work on this. There's an increased discussion on the potential synergies of gas and renewables going forward. So this is, I'll call it leading toward the pathway going forward of how do we get significantly increased decarbonization or clean energy or green growth, particularly in the power sector going forward. And one looks at that, and we've done studies of 80 or 90% of total U.S. power coming from renewables, essentially. There's a fair amount of energy efficiency, so let's not lose that. Demand response, so flexible demand in the system, as well as still some gas in the system, which allows the system to flexibly balance that load. There is some storage, but not significantly. And then let me just leave my comments with just a couple very small points. First off, depending on the utility you talk to and the business that you talk to, renewables are actually cost competitive today in some locations, not every location. And it depends on the business model and it depends on the price of the alternatives. So for example, rooftop solar in the retail market is completely competitive in California and in most parts of the Northeast in the United States. It doesn't actually need further subsidies. As well as if you talk to the major wind developers or wind utilities, they actually prefer buying wind over fossil fuel energies because of its scalability and the fact that it has a lower cost structure going forward and surety of that cost structure than fossils themselves. So a lot of other pieces I could add to it in terms of a pathway going forward if we have enough time at the end, but I'll stop there.
Wish you would. I remember Hunter Levins recently saying something that we'd feel a lot better about the shale gas finds in the United States if it was used as part of a strategy to make the transition rather than what she calls a party-on fuel. And so I think that depends on the policy response that you get from the U.S. Some comments from Martin?
Just two on the input from you. Personally, of course, I would like to see a world developed that is based on renewables and as clean and with as low a carbon footprint as possible. But I agree that this is going to take a while, and we're now looking at a few decades where I have mixed situation. And if we just for a moment are a little bit confident that renewables actually will have a great future sooner or later, and we're not quite sure about the timing yet, then we can get a little bit more ruthless and just use opportunities as they are. I was really surprised when a little while ago I heard that Total, the oil company, who are distributing kerosene in many parts of Africa to reasonably remote areas. They have basically put on the distribution of solar lamps as well. And I was a bit shocked when I heard this because somehow I got my competitive edge on this. But why not? Why not? They're actually agnostic. They want to provide energy. They want to make some money. They are a reasonably big company who probably will make sure that they maintain this system reasonably well, which is one of the really big issues. And why shouldn't, Total start to do this? It solves one of the big problems, that of distribution and maintenance. So let's just go for it. And then a second point that I wanted to make also from practical experience, we haven't talked about energy efficiency very much yet. And it always seems to be the little brother or the little sibling somewhere in the corner that one forgets about. And in fact, it's a giant. It's so big that people make it small because they don't quite look at it. A very practical issue in terms of financing and market development comes from Western Africa, where the Western African Union has established an own organization for renewable energy and energy efficiency called ECRI. ECRI, one of the first pieces of work that they did was they developed a voluntary standard for energy efficiency of white goods, washing machines, fridges, etc. Because there's a thriving market of second-hand white goods mostly from Europe into Western Africa. And they're sold at prices which make me a little bit ashamed as a European, because the prices in Western Africa for second-hand goods are not so very far away from the prices for new goods in Europe. But that's a secondary point. The primary point is that they are less energy efficient. And of course, all Western African countries have still problems with grid efficiency, with blackouts, etc. So that efficiency factor plays a role. And what the Western African countries do now, Ghana has just introduced, based on that voluntary standard for these white goods, a mandatory standard, which they phase in step by step, and they give buying incentives to clients who buy new white goods, and they work with the Association of Importers, Ghanese importers into Ghana, who actually used to import those second-hand white goods, so that they can actually make a transition and don't use their business completely. And most importantly, they're now talking to manufacturers in order to get some assembly plant into the country. So the backdrop behind that is also an industrialization backdrop or thought behind it. And I also don't want to talk about WTO, but I do want to talk about energy efficiency, because that's actually a major move to stabilize their electricity supply from a demand side.
I would love to talk about WTO if we had the time, but we don't. You make a very important point that the watt that you don't use is the most efficient and the cheapest, and that we probably don't pay enough attention to that. Dr. Parikh, final word?
Yeah, just a final word on one of the barriers that one didn't talk about is says, okay, we don't have energy access in large part of the country, and renewable energy are many times promoted as something that can provide decentralized local renewable energy systems. I think one of the major problems that comes here is finding people who can operate this, run it, maintain this, and that requires skills of engineering, technology, as well as business. And anyone with that kind of a skill would not find it staying in one village and operating it as a worthwhile proposition. There are many more opportunities outside. So one might need to do is to really go to a larger system of maybe give such a man 100 villages or a district to manage, and then he would also require a small grid. So the whole idea of mini grid or localized decentralization has to be properly thought out in this context.
Absolutely, important point. I just referred to the organizers, to the Secretariat, to ask whether we can take a few more minutes or whether we should try and wrap up now. We're out of time. Okay. Well, I'm sorry that we need to wrap up, because I think we've put some extremely interesting issues onto the table. And if we hark back to the three questions that we set out in the session note, maybe I could just make a few points stemming from this debate that at least are my interpretation of where we've arrived. The first is the positive narrative, the good news. There's a great deal of positive experience out there. And even from some of the negative or stumbling experience that we've seen in many countries, there's a great deal that we can learn, so that if countries that are setting out on a renewable energy strategy now have a lot of mistakes that they can avoid simply because they can look at the experience relevant to their countries that's been tried elsewhere. So there's a rapid movement in this field. There's a good reason for it. The market signals are beginning to look pretty favorable to renewable energy, but at the same time, we know that we can make mistakes quite easily, and they need to be avoided. We also, I think, have learned a huge amount about what it takes to get the mix right. There are many elements, many of them have been studied very intensively, and I think that we need now to look at an honest assessment of those obstacles that are really the key ones. And I think that a lot of the de-risking of renewable energy investment is right up there at the top. We need to create mechanisms that give greater confidence, greater predictability, greater long-term vision to potential investors, and thereby to create the kinds of markets that we know are out there to meet the demand that we are sure is out there. And doing this means getting a number of things right. I think the governance points that you made are absolutely essential. That we have to have the transparency, we've got to have the forums and platforms for dialogue. We need to have a space where investors, government, community activists, and others can come together and look for common solutions. And those are increasingly being created and deployed, and again, the lessons from those are absolutely essential. But I think that the final notion is one that is perhaps the most important point made here, and that is there's no solution for India that can be implemented in Mozambique, and there's no solution in the United States that is necessarily going to work in France or Spain, and that the successful strategy will always play into the political, institutional governance culture of the country, and to get it right means a really deep understanding of what that culture is and how best to play into it, particularly in dealing with the politics of it. So I come away from this discussion encouraged. I think that there's a great deal out there to do. I think we have a pretty clear idea of what it is we need to do, and that since we are all committed to speeding the transition to green growth, I'm sure that we can all identify a part of it that we can pick up and carry forward ourselves. So may I ask you in closing to give a round of applause to our panel. And to thank you very much for coming, and look forward to the rest of the program.